Welcome back to Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, part of the Migration Media Network. I'm Brendan Davis, your host, and today we have a special new jam. This will be an occasional feature. I'm going to call this the Big Fish Throwback, and the purpose of this kind of show is to highlight a previous guest whose episode you might have missed, but with new content added and some new context to give it this extra oomph and perspective of what's happened since the interview, and this will make it worth the listen and possibly a re-listen even if you heard it the first time. So why do this? Well, there are practical but mostly creative reasons to do so. The main reason is that as I am prepping to launch a new weekly show, and I'm getting a lot of these in the can with my co-host, I'm also getting ready for some really cool big announcements that affect Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, Migration Media, and basically everything else podcast and media related that I'm doing here. So I need to take a quick break from new interviews for a couple of weeks as I sort of focus on these other things to also make them really good. On a practical note, there's construction in my building that I just can't avoid. They're on lunch break right now as I record this, but it has really been an issue, and so that will hopefully end soon, but that also makes it trickier to schedule interviews with people. And lastly, we also just came out of some holidays, which took a lot of people out of town for a week or so, and so that put me a little behind. But basically, I don't want to put out any more shows that aren't up to my standards. I mean, I'm proud of pretty much everything I put out, but there are a few that I would love to have been even better. And so I just want to make sure that we maintain that consistency. So anyway, today and once in a while, when the occasion arises, I'm going to reintroduce and recontextualize a previous interview with someone who you might have missed, and I really want to make sure you heard this. So let's get into that. As I said, there is big news coming from the world of migration media over the next couple of months, and I am building up to those different announcements with a kind of greater purpose in my mind. I've been thinking a lot about this recently. You know, timing is a form of magic, and the whole circumstances by which I got to know today's guest and then what happened from there are a really great example of some magic too. So today's show highlights an interview you might have missed with Chrislyn Chu, one of the migration media partners, that was recorded shortly after I first met her, along with this new introduction to give you kind of the rest of the story since the initial release, and also to set that up in the first place. Now, I met Chrislyn at an entrepreneurs organization event that I also recorded and is linked as a special episode in the show notes. That event was emceed by AJ Warner, and he encouraged my friend John Dietz to speak. I met James Alon there. I saw Claudia Wasugar and the Troy's team folks. It was a really great, fun night. But meeting Chrislyn was really something else. Within minutes of meeting up with her, I really knew that I was talking to someone who I thought was extra special. She was a +1 with a friend who had wanted to go to the event, and she was waiting in line with her friend to talk to John Dietz, and I was kind of standing there as well. And basically, we started talking, and just very quickly, I was fascinated by her story, the little bits that I was getting out of it. And so we stayed in touch. We, of course, connected on WeChat, as you do. We stayed in touch. I invited her for coffee at my old office that I had over at Bong Bong. And within 5 minutes, I basically said, look, we should get on the mic. So this interview you're going to hear is really super raw. I mean, it's well produced, I think, but it has that goofy energy of a great first getting to know someone conversation. But since then, lots has changed. Chrislyn has been on one hell of a journey, and she is documenting it all to launch her new project, The Chrysalis Chronicles, which is why I especially wanted to release this today, because she just went live with Chrysalis Chronicles today. Now, the butterfly motif keeps coming up in my life a lot lately, especially on this other big new show that I'm working on with Ying Lee, which is a hint. There's a lot more on that coming soon. But even again last night, the butterfly effect, as they call it, was in action in a major way. And regardless of how that situation pans out, there was this, meeting a friend of a friend situation where it was just really amazing to ponder how I ended up having that particular conversation with this certain person at this place and at this time in the life cycle, both of the project that it kind of impacts and just my own life. So what Chrislyn is doing with both her video project and her new blog series is exploring her roots and those of other people like her who are from more than one place and are composed of maybe so many pieces of different places in space and time that they form some new hybrid and they don't feel like they fit into any one neat category. This end result is that they're sort of like continuing to be reborn with each new period of cocooning, and that's where the chrysalis motif comes into play, and I really like this. I can relate to this in my own way, being from so many places. I'll have more to say about my actual migration story as well in the weeks to come as we we get into some of that other news I've teased more than once. But now please enjoy the first of what has become many great conversations I've had with Chrislyn Chu. This whole thing has been remixed and remastered and now recontextualized to hopefully give you a very cool new experience listening to it, even if you heard it initially. So please enjoy it and check out Chrislyn's new video series and blog, The Chrysalis Chronicles, via the links in the show notes. All right, well, I'm here with Chrislyn Chu. Chrislyn, how are you today?
Doing great. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is pretty funny, and I will have done an intro before people are hearing this right now, so I'll have set this up a little bit. But we were totally just going to have a meeting, and we're talking, and I said, you should be on the podcast. And your response was what? How would you describe your response? Disbelief? What's going on? I wasn't prepared for this.
I was kind of shocked, to be honest. I walked in here expecting it would be, normal coffee chat. And when you invited me to share my story, I guess, I was like, well, I guess this is why I came to China. I guess, I came here to sign up for an adventure, get outside my comfort zone, and here we are, where I'm about to share hopefully something articulate.
I have high confidence in you being articulate. So my traditional first question will get us kicked off here, which is tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and for you, why China? What actually brought you here? And then we will get into the details.
Well, my name is Chrislyn. I am fresh off the boat, so to speak, coming to Beijing. I came here about a month and a half ago to improve my Chinese skills conversationally. I am an American. I was born in New Jersey. My parents are from Malaysia, but they are, I guess, part of the Chinese diaspora in Malaysia. And I always grew up very much feeling in between the U.S. and also in terms of between Asian countries. I remember my dad would always describe to me America is a melting pot and Malaysia is also kind of a melting pot, or perhaps a salad bowl, where you have a lot of cultures, a lot of people there. And sometimes, there is that shared Malaysian pride, but there's also a lot of, I think, pride in being Chinese, pride in being Malay and Indian, all these different things. And so I would often, go back home with my parents over the summers feeling like, oh, how do I fit in here as well? But I love the food, all those things that you associate with culture. I pride myself in being that. But then there's always the, but I can't speak any of the languages my parents can speak. Hokkien, Malay, Cantonese, Mandarin, English. Well, okay, I can speak English.
Yeah, I was going to say English,
right.
I'm going to have to give you a pass on that.
Right. And so for a lot of those reasons and just always feeling like in between, but loving all the parts that I'm in between, that kind of liminal space, I was like, no better time than now. I'm 24. I have some time to really figure out my roots. Yeah.
Well, this is, you actually hit on it. Part of this, honestly, the fact that you're 24, but you're smart enough to say things like liminal space. This is part of why you're on the microphone right now, because I really appreciated what you were telling me. And I won't tell tales because you're going to tell the tale. But especially, let's talk about a little bit about what you were doing sort of with your life's work, specifically as a storyteller. And then let's talk about thematically the things we were talking about. We'll get into this in pieces, but talk about storytelling. What actually prompted you into that? I know that you do photography and video and writing and all kinds of things. So yeah, tell us about that.
Well, I remember, I guess sometimes when people ask you why, right? Why do you do anything? I think whoever is the first person to ask you that, they're doing something right. You need more of those people in your life. I think the first time anyone asked me why was when I had to write a college essay. And I was like, I do photojournalism stuff for the high school newspaper. I'm the visuals editor. I know I'm the photo person. I'm that person with the camera. And I was like, this is what people know me for. This is what I love. But I cannot articulate why. And I felt like I usually like going back to read what I've written, but I've never gone back to reread my college essays because I feel like whatever I wrote, that was something that was like Frankensteined to fit what I thought people want to hear. But I was like, I did not know how to articulate why I loved taking photos. And it took, like 4 years through college to really just be like, wow, I like taking portraits of people because I love stories and I love the power of, connecting with an individual and that being a vehicle, like narrative transportation to connect with a larger universal kind of, abstract, big human theme. One of the pivotal moments for me was the summer halfway through college, summer after sophomore year. I went on a documentary film project to Colombia, Medellin, Colombia in South America. And we were participating in what we called a translingual writing workshop, where we were working with local university students. They're artists that grown up in a lot of the like displacement and violence, especially like with local gangs, in those neighborhoods, and just growing up with this tension of like, our city is so beautiful and we love our communities, but our hearts are also broken and we also have scars. And how do we capture all that? And they were just in this workshop. I remember when the artists were gathering there and we were working with them to like develop artist statements that they could use like in English and in Spanish for their portfolios. Like the first day, a whole bunch of them just broke down crying, like even a couple sentences into sharing about their art piece. And we learned later on that in I guess South America, when people are taught to write, it's usually in a very formal like business kind of sense. Like, you just leave the emotions out of it, just keep it business. Very unlike the whole, college essay where it's like, pour your heart out, pull on our heartstrings. And so this was really the first time that many of those students felt like they could actually share their story and have those emotions. And I was like, really? Wow. I've taken that for granted, right? I didn't even realize that people didn't have that space. And I think just being not a spectator, but like a witness, I guess, to just the power of having space to tell one's own story and be heard. And then, to realize, I'm not alone. And I like my pain, this is actually not what defines me. And there could be a purpose in this, and me sharing that, there's strength in that, and that can help other people. Like that is such a, like that is the thing that connects people, right? And so I think I just came back from that summer and I was like, whatever this was, I want to be part of it. This was what I was made to do. I just want to use whatever skills I have to let people have that freedom of just being known, even just knowing themselves and then knowing other people and just being known. Yeah.
So are you thinking that you're going to, do you see documentary as a career path for yourself?
Potentially. Yes. I don't think I would be able to stop documenting. I think I remember the day I realized that journal was the root of journalist. And I was like, I journal all the time. That's how I make sense of everything. And I don't think I will ever stop documenting my own thoughts and those of others. But in terms of like industry or professionally, I'm not sure. The place that I worked in North Carolina before coming here to Beijing, I worked at a place called Story Driven. And I feel so lucky to have had them as my first, I guess, formal workplace after college, because what we did was this hybrid of marketing and documentary and journalism, where basically, like, if you, like, say, Brendan, you needed a promo video for your podcast, right? And it's like, okay, why should people care? Well, if you use like story terms like hero and guide, it's like, okay, you're a podcast, or you, the host, you are guiding your listeners, the heroes, right, on some kind of journey where they can identify, with the journeys of the people that you're interviewing. And they will be like, wow, this has helped me somehow in my own life journey, right? And so like we would create these marketing videos for brands, for companies, for nonprofits, whatever, that were just like changing their space in the world with like a really, really kind of hopeful, they were redeeming something, restoring something, and creating these documentary style testimonials or stories where we'd be like, okay, we don't want to use marketing to sell story. Like we want to tell stories. We want to keep it authentic. So So I'm kind of like, I know enough about how hard the documentary world is and how draining it is to fundraise and write all the grants. And I have so much respect for people who do that. But there is a part of me that's like, how do we do this sustainably? And I've seen that it's possible to do that with story driven.
They actually have it as their business model
right.
and their success. I've heard of them. Sure. I know of those guys. Yeah. And you went to Duke, right?
Yes.
Right. And so this was your first job out of school.
Yes.
That's pretty fortuitous. Had you known of them prior to stumbling upon it, or was it a serendipitous thing?
It was quite serendipitous. I was actually interested in a fellowship that was offered through Duke. And it's this 1-year fellowship where they place recent graduates with local organizations that align with what they want to do professionally, vocationally. And so I talked to the director and was like, I love storytelling, but I also studied neuroscience and really geek out about storytelling. So I'm not just looking for like any kind of video production company. I'm looking for people who are crazy about story and think about it on a meta level. And my director was like, I met a person on the plane. We were going to the same conference. I was attending. He was filming it. Let me get back to you. And that guy was now my boss at Story Driven. So that was how the connection worked. And I started off as a fellow the first year and then transitioned to being an employee.
So part of what's interesting for me about this interview and what's unusual is that you are not the typical guest. You are actually not even living here full time. Technically, you're here on a tourist visa, yes?
Yep.
So let's talk a bit about why you're here and what it is that sort of led you here, both the actual mechanical parts and then the bigger philosophical and personal parts, which is what actually really was the most fascinating thing to me.
Well, the big kind of boot that just kicked me over here in terms of urgency, like I can't put this off any longer, was I've been in a long distance relationship with my boyfriend who I met in college. And he came over to China to work right after graduation in May 2016 that year. And so that was a big impetus for me not putting off coming to China. But I think besides that, or I guess in addition to that, it has been on my mind for a while to actually make that step and take time to learn the language. I think that's something that I've always associated a lot of shame with. I actually went to Chinese school for like almost 10 years growing up in the US. It was the Saturday school kind of thing. I became a very good test taker. I was really good at memorizing characters, and I could, so like I can read and I can write quite well. And so when I look at characters here now, I feel like I have all these characters in my head and they're all these people that I've met before, but I've forgotten all your names. So like that's how it feels when I'm here. But at home, we never spoke anything besides English. And so just that conversational ability and just using all the vocabulary that's underdeveloped. And so I definitely always in Chinese school felt like I hear all these other people, their parents are quote unquote real immigrants from mainland China. My parents are from Malaysia. In my Chinese, I don't really know, but whatever it is, I don't feel like I belong here. And so there's always just been that shame, and I've haven't really known what to do with it. And I'm been trying to get over it, and I'm just okay, I need to learn language. So yeah, I'm basically doing conversational classes while I'm here, and I love it. I really, really love, those moments of when you're actually understood and you actually understand something. It sounds so basic, but they make all the mental gymnastics of I'm speaking so simply right now and it's frustrating, but they make it worth it. And I have a couple local friends that I've met where literally just the other night we were walking down the street and they were like, oh, look, you can see the stars. That's rare in Beijing. You can see the stars at night. And I love looking at the stars. And next thing I know, I'm asking them, how do you...
And this is in Chinese.
Yeah, this is in Chinese.
They're commenting in Chinese.
Yeah,
and you're talking
they cannot really speak English.
Yeah.
So, which is good from a learning perspective. Really good for me from a learning perspective. And so I was I used to know how to sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Stars. And I forgot, can you teach me?
In Chinese?
In Chinese,
oh, okay.
yeah. And next thing you know, we're skipping down the street at like 8 o'clock at night, and they're teaching me how to sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Stars. And somehow I'm communicating to them like, oh, like you're like a Disney princess, and next thing you know, like birds are gonna come flying. And I'm like, I'm actually making a joke. I'm actually trying to be funny in Chinese, and they understood. And like, I was like, wow. This feels great. It's like little moments like that, just that wonder of learning again, I guess. Just, being known and knowing people. Like, I was like, this is why I came to China. And then in terms of just other events that were happening closer, that actually was like, I am thinking a lot about this. I can't avoid the fact that I'm thinking a lot about Asian American identity is, I think the last couple months, there were just a lot of I had a lot of friends from college who actually stayed on in Durham as well, and were involved in different ethnic identity related things, whether at church or on campus. And they were having a lot of conferences that were bringing students together from different schools to talk about identity. And I would find myself, being invited to either, help cook a bunch of food for all the students, but I was there, and there as like an extra mentor to facilitate group discussions, or I was there like to speak on a panel, like that, those kinds of things. And just realize, and just coming out of those events, just being like, wow, like there's so many students who don't realize that their ethnic identity matters and it's important. And for whatever reason, there are a lot of reasons, but for whatever reason, they've internalized this story that says, like, this part of me doesn't really matter, or this is a part of me that is actually like a burden to have, and it's something that I wish I didn't have, or it's something that seems like it's somehow a barrier to my success, or it gets in the way of people seeing me as a whole person. And so for me to be seen as a whole person, I need to take this part of myself and stand apart from it, stand at a distance from it, and not associate myself with that. There are a lot of stories of ranging from, the stereotypical, like, people who made fun of your food, your Chinese food that you brought to school, to just feeling like, oh, I'm not going to be seen equally when I apply for a job, or little like microaggressions of, oh, like that's your language, like what are those weird characters, and just like little things like that. That's just another reminder, like, oh, I'm an American, but there's this feeling like I need to prove that I actually am like who I am, and it gets tiring to try to keep proving like who you're not. And it's like, I would rather just use my energies to like talk about who I am rather than talk about who I'm not. Like, get your boxes away from me. And as a storyteller, I understand like archetypes, right? Like those are so useful, like, and even from a neuroscience perspective, like they exist for a reason. They help us make shortcuts in communication, right? To be able to communicate more efficiently. But when they don't capture or when they blind us to the nuance of reality and the complexity, like no person is a stereotype. When you dig far enough, like basically I came here because I was tired of spending my time feeling like just complaining about the boxes. And I was like, I actually want to tell my story instead of tell my not story, or tell like what I'm not. So I was like, all right, I'm going to come here and start trying to learn some words, in my quote unquote mother tongue, and try to figure out like what are ways that I've been socialized to even look down, upon other Chinese people, or look down on myself for being Chinese, and actually taking pride in that so much that I would want to share that with other people and celebrate that. Just the other week, my Chinese teacher, she's really interested in Beijing opera, and she's like the senior in college. And I was like, wait, young people actually like Beijing opera? I thought everyone thought it was, annoying. And then she invited me, and I went, and I was like, wow, this is definitely different, but I'm actually really enjoying it. Yeah. And you start to pick up on the rhythm, and like you just start to appreciate that quirky friend, for being that quirky friend instead of judging them as being strange, right? And I actually got really into it and loved, reading some of the, like, understanding the story. and appreciating some of the euphemisms, but also some of the really clever, like high level language and metaphors that they would communicate through the storytelling. Basically just appreciating this traditional form of storytelling and kind of being like, wow, it would be amazing, if I were to ever get to a place where I felt like, I can tell a story that is like a Chinese story and feel that it's authentic. I would love to be able to tell it in a medium that reflects, that honors, that learns from, traditional storytelling traditions, whatever those are. And so that was another moment that was like, oh, I'm glad I came. Whatever happens here, like no regrets.
So in terms of telling stories and getting in touch with your identity as, kind of reclaiming or, claiming this identity for yourself, basically, not having something imposed on you, not having it be whatever cutout someone wants to use, or not even having it be that shorthand that is, like you said, it exists for a reason and it's convenient, but it's also limiting when people make these assumptions. What are some of your assumptions that have changed dramatically in the, let's say, 2 months you've been here? This is part of why I wanted to get you on here, because I thought you'd have an interesting hot take on this. What were your perceptions and expectations, and then what's the reality as you're sitting in it now?
So one of the things that I distinctly have complained about with friends in the United States, other Asian Americans, is, Asians are so passive. Why are all of our, and obviously generalizing, but we're speaking to trends that we see when we make these absolutist kind of statements. But why are all of our, a lot of our parents or a lot of even other Asian Americans that we see as either apolitical or just kind of complacent, or they quote unquote buy into the narrative of just put your head down, don't cause trouble, just play by the rules, and that will get you far. That will help you achieve your American dream. Just play by the rules, assimilate, right? As you've been told to, don't cause trouble, right? And that's something that that we will complain a lot about. And I remember, oftentimes thinking when I would talk to my parents, about even their experiences in the workplace and when they encounter something that really wasn't fair, really wasn't just. And I would ask, so did you speak up for yourself, or did you try to communicate how you felt? There would be this kind of this resignation or passivity, but there would be the anger, but they wouldn't act upon it. And I would be sitting there how do you let them do this to you, right? I don't understand. And over time, I think from one, talking to my parents more, and expanding my own understanding of their stories, and then two, coming here and learning more about history of some of the early even just activists and community organizing that happened among Chinese communities in the US. And then just meeting people here who are Asian and who are Chinese and have opinions, right? And they have strong opinions. I'm like, wow, Asians are not passive.
Yeah, my Chinese friends here are not shy about their opinions. Right. They're as outspoken as anyone. But what do you think that is? Do you think that has to do with, in the case of your parents, being in a foreign country and wanting to try to assimilate and not sort of ruffle feathers? But here, people are home, and so they're at home. So at home, you can put your feet on the table. You don't do that if you're visiting somebody's house, right? So maybe they're more comfortable because they're at home and they can speak their mind.
I think that's definitely part of it, safe space, right? Safe and brave space. At the same time, I think there is a large element of generational trauma, generational communication or lack thereof. One of my friends who stuck around in Durham and is working with a lot of Asian American students to think about identity. One day I remember we were like, wow, why don't we just quit our jobs and just devote our lives to just telling the stories of our elders? like, that sounds amazing. And we're like not going to let ourselves, default on or avoid that, or push that off. And where that, I remember where that passion came from. We were just sitting there and we were like, there's someone with a grandmother who, and this is a Korean American, and their grandmother crossed from North Korea to South Korea riding on top of a train, and when you, wow. And when you hear a story, you're like that, you're like, wow, that is a really interesting case of someone engaging in, quote unquote, illegal border crossing, that might actually connect them to stories that you've heard of people of undocumented immigrants on the North American continent and North and South American continents. And you start connecting those dots of like solidarity and shared struggle. And it's like, and that starts to break some of those preconceptions about, one group is passive, one group will take risks and one group won't take risks. And just even recognizing that in like our own families. My grandmother, my dad's mom, she sold her house to buy my dad a one-way plane ticket to go to college in the United States.
Wow.
Right? Like that is a huge risk. That is not passive. That is very, very, very proactive.
No pressure on your dad.
Right, exactly. Right. And so a lot of these things where older generations, like, and also just with, technology and everything growing so fast that each generation, how they grow, the world around them looks different growing up, right? But like, okay, so with that environmental context, like each older generation wants to protect the younger generation from having to go through whatever pain, whatever struggles they've had. And that can include silence, or that can include being expressed through silence, where it's like, we don't want to talk about what we experienced, in this tumultuous period of history in our homeland, because we don't want your lives to be like that. And also it pains us to also talk about that, especially if they've never processed it with anyone. It can be painful to relive that trauma when you tell it. And so I think there's a lot of, to answer your question, I think realizing that there's a lot of generational trauma that leads our elders to want to protect us, right? It comes from such a loving place. They want to protect us from that. And that's why they don't pass on these stories. It's helped me become a lot more understanding and not be so critical. But at the same time, I do lament like when younger generations who have grown up with more privileges and more freedoms than older generations, and they don't understand the stories and of all the sacrifice and all the hard work and all the blood, sweat, and tears that enabled them to have what they have, right? Then they grow up without that gratitude and without that humility that would then lead in the same generosity to keep passing forward, or, to just be generous and treat everyone as your neighbor and, common, shared humanity. And so there definitely is a need for those stories to be shared so that people know, where's all that I have? Where does that come from? Who do I have to thank? I mean, that's why I love stories like Moana and Coco. Whether it's Polynesian culture or Mexican culture, the basic story arc is, here are people who have lost memories, who have forgotten who they are, who they truly are. And when they forget, they live out of fear. And when you think about like a posture of, are your hands tight and closed and like gripping onto something because you're afraid, right, to let go, and you're afraid of instability, but you're afraid, versus the posture of like, hands open, and you're able to love and give because you have so much love to give, and you know who you are, and you love that, you know why that's meaningful, why there's purpose for that in the world, and you can be generous and like love from abundance. Like that's what I see in those movies, where I just see, Moana and Miguel like going on these journeys where they're like, I feel like deep down, I'm an explorer, and like, they can't shake these things out of me. And now they have to go on this journey to rediscover those roots. And then when they're able to remember, right, they're able to help the rest of their community remember as well. And there's like this collective awakening, right? And I'm like, that's what I want to see in the world. Like, what would it look like, for Chinese Americans, for any kind of diaspora people, right? Who feel like they have so many parts of themselves that all define them and are all beautiful, but then they have these, these categories of, oh, this is what it means to be a full legitimate American. This is what it means to be a full legitimate Chinese person. Like, those categories will change depending on who you ask. I mean, just, being Chinese, right? Like, I asked one person and they're like, oh, being Chinese is a way of life. It's, being hardworking. It's having these values. It's even like, really loving money. They'll put all these kind of values into it. Oh, that's what it means to be Chinese. But then there's a whole like, oh, you're Chinese if any member of your family ever came from China, and it's more of a, biological, ethnicity kind of thing.
Right.
Or you can speak the language. Like, it will depend. And so when the definition is going to change like that, it's like, well, where do you anchor your identity in exactly? And for me right now, that is a question that I'm really curious. Like, where do you anchor your identity when your identity has so many pieces to it? That have so many definitions, and how do you know, like, what is a definition that you can actually trust and like live out of with the same like wholeness that you see, Moana and Miguel and their families live out of at the end of those movies. And so as we just think about how, the whole world is becoming more and more multi-ethnic, like that's where we're headed, like with globalization and just, mobility, right? Literally physical mobility. And I was just given a book by a friend that I hope to read that is about multi-ethnic Asian American identities, where you have people ranging from, a Mexipino to like, a Black Ganawan, and, we're creating new language because we're like, we don't currently have language that captures the complexities of our categories, our ethnic identity categories. And so we're creating new language to try to capture that. But basically, as the world is moving towards being more multi-ethnic and more blended, I'm wondering, how do cultures interact such that, like, a new culture is created? Like when you talk to a lot of folks who are biracial or multiracial, some of the stories I've read, they'll share, I've learned to take pride in, X culture and Y culture. They're both part of me. And I recognize how, when I'm in the country of X culture, certain things might be emphasized more, or people will be more surprised by certain things. But like, I just focus on, why am I proud to be part of that culture? And I celebrate that. And I invite other people to celebrate that. When I'm in Y culture, same thing. And you know what? It's okay that I'm not purely X or purely Y, like I am, this X cross Y, whatever thing. And that's awesome. And you know what? I am in this position to be like, almost like a cultural ambassador in a way, like a code switcher, like this person that your strength is being adaptable. And I think, going back to that question you asked of, how has my thinking just changed being here? I think it's definitely gone from being like, oh, we're so passive, to being like, oh, we actually have strengths. Like there is a strength to being someone with kind of a fractured identity, in that you learn to be really adaptable, and you learn to empathize and see things from a lot of different perspectives. You're able to realize that like there is not one way of, like, there's not one normal. There's not one, like if you draw from the fish out of water analogy, there's not one kind of water. There's not one way the water flows. They can have different colors and, a whole lot of other stuff going on in it. And all of them have their strengths. And so I think that adaptability is a strength that I'm recognizing, that I am like like, that's what I see in my parents, that like, you know, they left their home countries and came to United States, and they've been able to provide me and my brother with a very comfortable upbringing. And I've totally taken that for granted. And in the past, where I've criticized them for being too passive, I think in the last like couple months or so, even just thinking, like preparing for this trip to China, like I remember my dad was like, I hope you have fun learning to be an immigrant in a way. And I was like, I don't know if it's comparable to your experience. It's not. I can kind of leave whenever I want.
Yeah, your dad didn't have an iPhone to help him out.
Yeah, he did not have an iPhone to help him out. No Google Maps or anything. Or actually, sorry, Baidu Maps. No Baidu Maps.
Sure. Yeah, what's Google?
Yeah. We don't support.
Yeah, I've got to do
here.
a Bing and find out what a Google is.
But basically, I was just like, wow, like, my parents are supporting me on this journey, and I just wonder how they feel of, wow, like our daughter wants to use this money that we've saved up for her to, you know, have a great career, whatever, but she wants to go back to Asia. She wants to leave America. We raised her here in America so she can make a life here. Well, she wants to go back to Asia to explore her roots. And there's a part of me that wonders if they may feel like, oh, you know, what, did we fail in some way, you know, to like raise her with some strong sense of identity? And I don't know. I haven't had that conversation with them. I don't know if they would share that with me per se, but it's something that makes me conscious of actually trying to communicate and think about, you know, okay, this is what it's like for me now. How does this help me empathize with their experience when they were fresh off the boat or the airplane or whatever when they came to the United States? And how are the things that I'm struggling with here? What are good questions that I can now think of to actually ask my parents? And so, I mean, even just coming here and being like, oh my gosh, people look at me and they think that I speak Chinese because I look Chinese, and I can't speak Chinese because I didn't grow up in China. It'll just spark the question that I've never asked my parents before then of like, you know, how did you find community when you got to the United States? Was there differences in how you, like, your experience with education? And then my dad, he came to a liberal arts school in the US. My mom went to college in Australia. It's like, Mom, you know, what was your experience with da-da-da-da? And I had a really good conversation with her, where she was just sharing about how, because of like some financial constraints and whatnot, like she actually didn't really have much opportunity to actually break out of just meeting other Malaysian people and making more friends, because like she couldn't afford to stay on campus in a dorm because that was too expensive, so she just stayed in an apartment like with another Malaysian person and stuff like that, where I was like, wow, you know, like, and you know, it starts to sink in, and you start to realize and start to be grateful. And I think that changes how you just go forward into life instead of being entitled. Because, someone did something to make this happen in my life, but I've always had this benefit in my life, so I should always have this benefit in my life. Like, you need to know like the past to understand why the present exists, and think, you know, how can we create a future where other people can experience the richness of life that I also have?
That is a perfect way to end this chapter 1. I'm looking forward to another conversation when you've got more than 2 months here. I can't imagine what insights you'll have. Chrislyn, thank you so much.
Thank you.